In this video tutorial, we will go over using the Autopilot functions for a GPS Runway 4 LPV approach into Wasilla. We are lined up on runway 25 at Merrill. Let's center the heading bug first to match the runway heading. We will also tune in the Big Lake VOR frequency 112.5 on nav1 and switch the CDI to VOR mode. Let's imagine that we were told to fly the runway heading and intercept the 340 course to the VOR, or in other words, the 160 radial inbound. Let's also set up the GPS by inserting a direct path to Wasilla for now. Let's say our initial altitude clearance is 3,000 feet. So let's set that using the altitude knob, and we should see it highlighted in cyan. In this example, I plan to climb at VY of 74 knots and fly runway heading, so I will pre-plan the flight director by selecting heading and FLC mode, which is flight level change, and set the speed using the nose up or nose down buttons to select 74 knots. Note that another method would be to select go around and heading modes for the flight director for takeoff, then select FLC mode once you are in the climb and pitched for a speed that you wish to climb at. Now we're cleared for takeoff. Note the flight director command bar. The flight director does not mean you have autopilot engaged, as reflected in the mode section, indicating FD rather than AP. Normally we would select autopilot at a higher altitude, but let's go ahead and select it now for the purpose of this tutorial. Notice that it indicates AP in the scoreboard above the attitude indicator and is green. Active modes are in green, armed modes are in white. So in this particular situation, we have heading mode active, autopilot active, FLC mode at 74 knots active, and altitude select armed for 3,000 feet. The plane should stop climbing and accelerate once reaching 3,000 feet. We climb in FLC mode, never in vertical speed mode, to avoid inadvertent stalls. We only descend in VS mode and will be seen later in the video. Let's assume we got the shoreline departure with a deviation. Once we reach the shoreline, we can rotate the heading bug to start turning towards the practice area. That beep you heard was the 1,000 feet to the selected altitude alert. It is typical for pilots to announce 1,000 to level as a good practice. Once we see the VOR course alive, and after verifying the frequency using the Morse code, we can select nav mode to follow the CDI that we selected, which in this case is a course of 340. The airplane should now track that course. Once we've reached 3,000 feet and the airplane accelerates to our cruise speed, we can pull the power back and do our cruise checks and set power accordingly to ensure we do not redline the engine. It's a good habit to center the heading bug if it isn't already, even while in a mode that is not heading mode. While we have some time in tracking the VOR, let's go ahead and load the LPV approach into Wasilla and set the decision altitude. We would tune in for the weather and request the practice approach at this time and prepare to brief the approach. Let's assume that we would be cleared for the straight in and can skip the hold at Aver. Whenever switching from one navigation source to another, it is a good habit to first switch over to heading mode, then change the navigation source, then push nav again. If we're cleared for the approach, we can select 2,500 feet. We descend using vertical speed and use the nose down to set a negative 500 feet per minute descent. Reduce power once the descent initiates to maintain a desired speed. In this case, we'll descend at 100 knots since we're working our way toward Aver. Once we reach 2,500 feet, the autopilot should revert to altitude hold mode and we'll need to add power again. Prior to the final approach fix, you should make sure the GPS switches to LPV. Between Aver and Frizzle, you can hold 2,500 feet and capture the glide slope. Push approach mode once you see LPV is active, and the glide path mode should be armed. As the glide path indicator comes in, it is a cue that you should start preparing to descend. Usually a half dot above the glide path, pull the power back to slow down to 90 knots, then put in 10 degrees of flaps to slow down to be between 80 to 90 knots through the final segment of the approach. Make sure you have completed your approach and before landing checklists prior to this point. I also recommend using the term clicks before the final fix to remind yourself to turn on pilot-controlled lighting at airports that have that. Another good saying at the final approach fix is final approach fix inbound, altimeters and instruments cross-checked, no flags, missed approach, altitude set. This is a good way to ensure you still have LPV guidance, your altimeter is set to the arrival airport, and you set the missed approach altitude in the altitude selector. In this case, it would be 3,000 feet. Ensure your heading bug is centered in preparation for a go-around if necessary. In this scenario, Wasilla's touchdown zone elevation is 352 feet, so I would call 1,000 to touchdown when the altimeter indicates 1,350 feet. I would then call 500 to touchdown at 850. Then I would call approaching minimums at 510 feet, which is 100 feet above the DA. At minimums, we'll call minimums airport not in sight, going around. This is followed by pushing go around to disconnect the autopilot and to set the flight directors to GA mode. Add full power and pitch up to the command bar to climb to 1,000 feet. If things look good during the straight out climb, you can push heading and FLC and can engage the autopilot again. At 1,000 feet, flaps should come up and the turn should be initiated while continuing the climb to 3,000 feet. Once the GPS is sequenced appropriately for the missed approach, you can then switch over to nav mode. Since we are tracking to a VOR, it's not a bad idea to switch to heading mode, ensuring the bug matches the required track at this point, and change the navigation source to VOR and track it inbound, then switch back to nav mode. This concludes this example of using the autopilot for an LPV approach to Wasilla. Thank you.